Okay guys, so it's been quite a while since I've done a rod review. So when James over at Piscifun contacted me and asked me if I would review one of their new Torrent rods, I jumped at the chance to do so. So here is the Piscifun Torrent rod. It's a good looking rod, as you can see. It's got the black and red accents, which are really popular. And I took a look at the different lengths and powers. I'm going to put a picture of that here in the video for you guys. And I decided to get the 7'1" medium heavy fast, which they list as a jig rod. Now the reason I picked the 7'1" medium heavy fast is because medium heavy with the fast action is a rod that's supposed to be able to pretty much do everything. You know, cast and retrieve reaction style baits like crankbaits, etc. But also be able to work that bottom contact. And of course, this is a jig rod, according to Piscifun. So I wanted to test out my jig skills because I haven't fished a jig in a while. Okay, so I'm gonna break this review down into a few different parts. The first part is I'm going to go over all the features of this rod. Now it's got 9 stainless steel guides with titanium oxide inserts. So that's 8 guides plus the tip for a total of 9. It's got a Fuji PTS style reel seat. So I don't think this is the real Fuji brand reel seat, but it is a knockoff of the PTS, which is one of Fuji's latest reel seat designs. If you've never fished it, it's pretty comfortable, very comfortable actually. And this blank here is supposed to be a IM6 carbon 30-ton graphite blank. And it's smooth sanded, there's no gloss on it. And the rod itself has got a nice crisp, hollowish feel to it. So I'm going to put a list of pictures of the weights of this rod. I believe this rod weighed in at 4.8 ounces. And I'm going to put a picture of several rods that I weighed. So 4.8 ounces for this power and length is actually pretty good. And this thing actually, I should say this blank is supposed to feature 2 Shimano style technologies. I didn't see an actual marketing terminology for those techs, but it's supposed to have a Spiral X style blank inside and also a High Power X wrapping, but you can't see it because it's on the allegedly on the inside of this top layer. So there's no real way for us to confirm unless, you know, we broke the blank, which I'm not going to do. But I can tell you this much: this blank or this rod is ridiculously strong. I will post a video of these 2 guys that were trying to break one of these rods. They were casting, you know, water balloons. They were trying to pick up a bucket of cement. They're trying to do all sorts of crazy things to break one of these rods. Eventually they had to tie this thing to a steel gate and then use a truck to pull the line to eventually break this rod, and it broke, I believe, somewhere at the handle. So these rods are stupid strong. But yeah, I'm gonna leave a link to that video. It's pretty funny. Now, also, as you can see, it's got a hook keeper at the top, and these rods feature American style lengths and actions, meaning most of them are over 7 foot. There's a couple that are, I think, 6'8" or 6'10". But if you ever imported a rod from Japan or overseas, generally they tend to be on the softer side as far as the action and the powers, and shorter on the length side. So it's apparent Piscifun is marketing this Torrent rod towards us American anglers, which is good. Now the great thing about this rod is that it's only 60 bucks. And I'm going to leave a link in the description on how to get one of these rods. But the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go to part 2, which is the casting portion of this. And I'm going to see if this thing casts like a Shimano that has the Spiral X and High Power X. Because if you've ever casted a Shimano that has that blank technology, you'll know that it's different than rods that don't have it. The casts are straighter. You can feel the rods are a lot straighter when casting. The accuracy is better. So let's get to that. Okay guys, now you would think that since this is a Piscifun rod that I would be pairing it up with a Piscifun reel, but unfortunately the Perseus that I have, I could not locate it in time for the shooting of this video. Now I did mount the Piscifun Phantom on this rod, but it was very unbalanced and tip heavy because the Phantom was so lightweight. Now instead what I did was I chose to put on a heavier reel, the 2012 Shimano EXSENCE DC, and it balances perfectly with this rod. Now the reel weighs in at 8.5 ounces in case you were wondering. So basically I'm going to be using a 1/2 ounce square bill that's closer to 5/8 of an ounce, and I'm using 12 to 14 pound fluorocarbon. Now this is a pretty stiff rod. As you can see, it does not have one of those very flexible soft tips that a lot of fast and extra fast rods feature. So yeah, let's see what happens. Now I'm going to set this reel to the fluorocarbon mode since I'm running fluoro, and I'm not really going for distance. I'm just basically trying to get a feel for the casting characteristics of this rod. And from what I can tell you, it was very stiff. Now right here, I thought I caught a fish, but instead I caught salad. The vegetation in this area is dying as they're draining the lake. But yeah, the rod is very stiff. Now I'm actually used to using stiff rods for casting. I actually like to use fast and extra fast rods for certain techniques. But it took me a couple of casts to get used to how stiff this rod is, because the square bill was barely even, loading the rod up. Now I'm sure that if I had a heavier lure, it would have aided in the casting feel, but that's all I had for the moment. Now this is a jig rod, but as far as casting duties, it will do the job. And as far as the similarities to a Shimano that has the High Power X wrapping or the Spiral X technology, I should have brought one along with me to do a side-by-side comparison, but I can tell you that once you get used to the stiffness of this rod, that you can tell that this does have those technologies that Piscifun showed us in that thumbnail on their website. And basically you can do pinpoint accurate casts because the rod seemed to track very straight when casting either overhead or sidearm. So yeah, that's pretty good. Now of course I wouldn't use this rod as a dedicated crankbait rod, but in a pinch it will work for those type of reaction baits. But once again, this is a jig rod, so the second portion of this video, or the third portion I should say, we will be testing the sensitivity and how it fishes the lure that it was intended to use, which was a jig. Okay guys, so now we're getting to probably what is the most important test for this rod, and that is the sensitivity especially when fishing a jig, since this is a designated jig rod according to Piscifun. Now, this particular lake, there was a muddy bottom with a lot of rocks and dead vegetation like sticks, and the sensitivity was actually pretty good. I could definitely tell the difference between a stick and a rock once I drug the jig over that particular piece of structure, and I can definitely tell when the jig went from the mud bottom to hitting a rock. Now, the sensitivity is definitely not that pinprick sharpness of, let's say, an NRX, but it was definitely sensitive enough, especially given the price point for this rod. Now, over here, apparently there was some algae built up at the bottom, and I could definitely tell there was a little bit of difference between the algae and the mud bottom. So now I've switched places and I've switched jigs, and I'm going with more of a finesse jig. I believe it's a Strike King 3/16 ounce with a net bait Paca craw, the mini trailer, and I'm just pitching around this little cove, and you'll see a lot of activity here. Now, this is the middle of the day, and it was probably a good 95 degrees out, and it was hot, and probably the best time to fish for jigs, fishing slow and methodical, which is one of the reasons I never really got into jig fishing, because I'm kind of impatient. I don't like to sit there and drag a jig for 2 minutes across the bottom of a lake hoping for a strike. But I did it just to see if I could get a bite, and the pitching of this rod is pretty decent, and it loaded up that little jig and trailer pretty decent for casting as well. Now, of course, the EXSENCE is a great casting reel, and that helped a lot. But yeah, once again, this bottom portion was mud and sticks and rocks, and I could definitely tell the difference when the jig went from mud to rock. It's pretty easy, and then I felt the thump, and I could feel the bass holding this jig in its mouth, so I was able to set the hook. So yeah, this thing, you can definitely tell the difference between a take and versus hitting structure. So I'm gonna have to give this a very good rating for sensitivity. Okay, first bass on the Piscifun Torrent. I felt this bass strike and thump at it, so sensitivity is pretty good, I'll have to say. It's a little guy, but we'll take him. Well, I caught another one, but unfortunately I didn't get the hook set. This one's a little bit better. He's about a pound, I guess. Okay guys, so you can see I've been able to put some time in on the water fishing this rod, and let's go over my final thoughts. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the build quality of this rod, and on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give this thing a 9. Now, it's got a straight blank, and it's got completely straight guides, and if you don't think that straight guides are a big deal, I have a LOOMIS NRX that costs $500, and all the guides on that thing are not straight, and that really pissed me off when I discovered that little fact. So for a $60 rod to have guides that are completely straight, I'd say that's a plus. Now, the epoxy around the hook keeper and around the guides is clean. There's no extra runoff or anything like that. And yeah, now the only reason this doesn't get a 10 is because of one thing, and that is this right here. Hopefully you guys can see that, but the transition from the blank to the reel seat is not flush, and you can definitely feel with your finger running over that you run into that sharp edge of the reel seat. Now, depending on the way that you palm, you may find that annoying. Unfortunately, I didn't feel it because I don't think I really put my finger up there. But yeah, that's what keeps this thing from getting a 10 out of 10 in build quality. And I don't know if it's my particular rod that has this issue and the rest don't, or if they all do, but that's something that Piscifun should probably look into. Make that a little bit more flush, like the Zodius here. You can see that the transition from rod to reel seat is a little more seamless. You can definitely tell when you hit the reel seat, but it doesn't have that sharp edge because the transition is a lot cleaner than on the Piscifun. Okay, so let's talk about casting. Now, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd give this thing a 7 in casting. And that's a pretty high mark, I'd say, because this thing is not made for casting and retrieve techniques. This is made for jig fishing. Now, cast straight and true, very accurate. Now, like I said before, I wish I would have had a Shimano with the high power X wrap so I can get a good feel for the difference, but I would say this thing is up there, and the blank technology they use seems to work. So all the energy I put into the cast goes straight forward towards my mark, and there's no wobbling of the rod when doing that. Now, of course, the rod is very stiff, being that it's a jig rod, but luckily I'm used to fishing or casting, stiff rods. But someone who's not used to casting stiff rods may not like it. And of course, this is not made for crankbait fishing, but it will do crankbait fishing and other types of cast and retrieve style fishing in a pinch with no problem. Okay, so let's talk about the sensitivity of this rod. Now, if the LOOMIS NRX, which is currently considered the benchmark of sensitivity, if that's a 10 out of 10, then this is a good solid 8 out of 10. Now, that may seem like a high mark, but yeah, let me tell you about this thing. Now, you can definitely feel when dragging that jig along the bottom, the difference between hitting a rock versus hitting vegetation or a stick, the difference between mud and algae, and more importantly, you can definitely tell the difference between a fish striking and taking the jig versus hitting a piece of wood or a rock. So how many of you guys have set your hooks into wood or rocks thinking that it was a fish strike? So with the fish that I caught, I absolutely knew that those were fish strikes and takes versus hitting a piece of structure. And that's basically the most important thing about rod sensitivity, is knowing what is a fish strike versus what isn't a fish strike. Okay, so let's talk about what I like about this rod. Now, the one thing that caught my attention immediately is the thickness of the handle. It's thicker than average for rods these days. Now, to show you guys the difference, here's the Zodius. You can see that the Zodius tapers down into a thinner handle, and when I first started fishing handles like this, my hand would cramp up because there's really not much to grab onto. I eventually got used to it, but going from this to this, there was an immediate difference, and you can tell during casting as well. There's much more rod to grip onto, which is something that I value in casting. So yeah, I like the thicker handle, and I like the fact that they made this exposed blank area red. And of course it's red on top as well, but of course your reel is going to be covering that. But this is a nice little touch here that attracts some attention, a nice little styling cue. Now, the last part I'm going to talk about is directed to Piscifun and just some things that I personally would change. Now the first thing I would change is replace this with a better looking, more elaborate detailed forenut. I've seen some competitor rods from some competing companies, and they have better looking forenuts than this. Now that may raise the price of the rods, but I personally would pay the price for a better looking forenut. And I don't think you need this much threading. So when the reel was mounted on the rod and it was tightened down, there was a lot of exposed threads there, which I personally don't like. So you don't need this much thread. And another thing is put the carbon tape wrapping on the outside of the blank so we can see it, and that would definitely make it look a lot better. As you can tell, with the Zodius, they put the carbon tape crisscrossing the blank on the outside, and that looks really, really good. It makes it look like a much more expensive rod. Now, of course, you know, you would probably have to cover it with a coat of gloss and lose this sanded blank, but I would gladly take that. I don't think it would affect sensitivity that much. But yeah, overall for $60, if I only had 60 bucks to spend on jig rod, I would definitely spend my money with this. I was really pleased by the sensitivity of it and the fact that I could, you know, tell the different kinds of structure and of course the fast strikes and takes. So yeah, I'm gonna leave a link in the description on how to get this rod. And the good thing is, apparently they have a good warranty, and they've added some two-piece rods to the mix as well, which from what I've seen are only 40 bucks, so they're cheaper for those of you who like those two-piece rods to stow in the back seat of your car. Okay guys, that's my review of the Piscifun Torrent rod, and thanks a lot.